The plane hummed constantly as it soared through the darkened sky, flying thousands of meters above the Atlantic Ocean. Maria looked out the window, her reflection barely visible against the growing twilight. She had never liked flying, but this trip was inevitable. A family emergency had forced her to return to the United States, and she had no choice but to board the flight, despite her anxiety. Next to her, an elderly woman slept, her head moving slightly with the plane's movements. Maria shifted in her seat, trying to get comfortable, but something felt off. It wasn't the usual turbulence or the claustrophobia that sometimes overwhelmed her on long flights. It was something else, a feeling of being watched. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. She reached for the in-flight magazine to distract herself, flipping through the pages without paying much attention. However, out of the corner of her eye, she continued noticing movements. The dim cabin lights cast strange shadows, and every time she looked toward the back of the plane, she only saw rows of sleeping passengers and flight attendants working silently. As the hours passed, the unease within her grew. She decided to get up and stretch her legs. Walking toward the back of the plane, she passed by several rows of people either asleep or absorbed in their headphones, eyes closed. The plane felt unusually cold, as if the air conditioning was malfunctioning. When she reached the last row, something caught her attention. A man sitting alone, staring straight ahead. His skin seemed extremely pale and his eyes were deeply sunken. Maria stopped, feeling a knot in her stomach. She hadn't seen him board the plane, and his stillness was unsettling. She quickly averted her gaze, trying to ignore the unease, and headed to the restroom. When she opened the door, a blast of icy air greeted her, making her breath condense in the small space. Goosebumps rose on her skin, and before she could react, the lights flickered violently, plunging everything into an intermittent gloom. The faint emergency light outside was the only thing illuminating the space. Maria's heart raced, and as she turned to open the door and leave, she heard a voice. At first it was a murmur, but it quickly grew more intense, though not clear, filled with urgency. Maria spun around quickly, expecting to see someone else in the restroom, but it was completely empty. The whisper continued, as if it were coming from the walls or even the mirror. She backed up to the door, breathing heavily, and opened it hastily, stepping into the hallway. She almost collided with a flight attendant. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the flight attendant asked, looking concerned. Maria glanced back, seeing the restroom now perfectly lit and calm. "Yes, I'm fine," she muttered, though her voice betrayed the fear she felt. She hurried back to her seat, feeling the cold prickling her skin. The elderly woman beside her was awake, staring at her with terrified eyes. "Did you see it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "See what?" Maria replied, her heart racing. "The man," the old woman whispered. "I recognized him. I saw him on the news." Maria froze. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "That man is a fugitive," the woman said in a barely audible tone. "He's been on the most wanted list for years, kidnapped and killed several people." A chill ran down Maria's spine. "That's impossible," she whispered, trying to convince herself. "I swear it's him." The woman grabbed her with surprising strength. "He's sitting in the last row. I recognized him as soon as I saw him. They never caught him." Maria's mind raced, feeling the terror creeping in. Slowly, she turned in her seat, looking for the man at the back of the plane. He was still there, completely still. No one else seemed to notice anything unusual. Panic gripped her, and she grabbed the flight attendant as she passed by. "There's a man back there. Something's not right." The flight attendant looked toward the back of the plane, and her face turned pale. "It can't be," she whispered, more to herself than to Maria. "What?" Maria demanded, her voice rising. I recognized him too." Her gaze was nervous. "I heard he hijacked a flight years ago. They never caught him." The terror Maria felt was palpable. "But he's still there. He's real," she insisted. The flight attendant shook her head slowly. "That man is extremely dangerous," she said with a trembling voice. "But he can't be here. The flight is under strict surveillance." Maria's heart pounded as she looked back again. The man had vanished, his seat now empty. However, the coldness in the air still lingered. The plane jolted violently, drawing her attention forward. The cabin lights flickered again, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. We are experiencing unexpected turbulence." The plane tilted sharply, causing passengers to scream. Maria gripped the armrest, her knuckles white. The old woman beside her began muttering prayers. The man's face appeared in Maria's mind again, his empty eyes waiting. And then she had a terrible realization. It wasn't just turbulence, it was something much worse. They were trapped with him. The intercom crackled again, but instead of the captain's voice, there was only static. Suddenly the plane plummeted, the oxygen masks dropping from the ceiling as passengers screamed in terror. Maria could barely breathe as her mind tried to process what was happening. Amid the chaos, she heard the desperate whisper once more. She looked back one last time, her heart stopping as she saw the figure of the man standing at the back of the plane, a disturbing smile on his face. The lights went out completely as the plane continued to descend. The cabin lights flickered as the plane taxied down the runway, ready for takeoff. Daniela settled into her seat by the window, her fingers gripping the armrest tighter than usual. She had flown many times before, but that night something felt off. Maybe it was the thick fog covering the airport or the strange mechanical hum she had heard when boarding, but the unease tormented her, refusing to go away. She observed the other passengers. Most seemed relaxed, some reading magazines or looking at their phones. A few rows ahead, a family was laughing softly, their young daughter pointing out at the wing. Everything seemed normal, but still, the uncomfortable feeling in the back of her mind only grew as the engines roared to life. When the plane ascended into the dark, cloud-covered sky, Daniela closed her eyes, trying to calm her anxiety. The seatbelt sign turned off, and passengers began to move about, stretching their legs and heading to the restroom. Daniela rested her head, hoping a nap would calm her nerves. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the cabin, making her shiver. Daniela opened her eyes, startled. It was too cold, unnaturally so. She rubbed her arms and looked around. No one else seemed to notice. The air became colder, and then she heard it, a soft hum, almost like a whisper. At first, she thought it was coming from the air vents above her head, but the sound had a strange quality, organic, as if it were coming from deep within the plane. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and with it came an overwhelming sense of dread. Daniela straightened up, scanning the cabin. Something was wrong. The lights were dimmer than before, flickering slightly, casting long shadows. The passengers around her seemed distant, as if they were slowly fading away. Daniela blinked hard, trying to clear her vision, but the strange sensation persisted. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A man was standing at the end of the aisle near the emergency exit. He was dressed in a dark suit, but there was something odd about his rigid posture, with his head tilted slightly to one side. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at the door. Daniela's heart began to race. She looked around, expecting others to react, but no one seemed to notice. The flight attendants continued with their tasks, oblivious to everything, and the passengers remained absorbed in their distractions. "Excuse me," she whispered to the man beside her. "Do you see that man?" The man looked up from his book, confused. "What man?" Daniela pointed, but when she looked again, the man had disappeared. Her blood ran cold. He had vanished in the blink of an eye. Trying to shake off the growing fear, she pressed the call button for a flight attendant. A young woman appeared moments later, smiling politely. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" she asked. "There was a man standing by the emergency exit," Daniela stammered. "He was there and then he disappeared. Something doesn't feel right." The flight attendant's smile faltered for a second, and her expression turned tense. "I'll check on it, ma'am. Please remain seated." As the flight attendant walked away, Daniela's unease grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't imagining things. The cold, the hum, the figure something was wrong on that flight. Minutes passed and the flight attendant didn't return. Daniela glanced toward the back of the plane and her stomach dropped. The emergency exit door was slightly ajar, just a crack, but enough to make her breath catch in her throat. Cold air was seeping through, misting around the door. Before she could react, the lights flickered again, plunging the cabin into brief, terrifying darkness. The plane jolted violently as if hitting turbulence, but something felt different. The entire aircraft seemed to shudder. When the lights returned, the hum was louder than ever. Daniela's hands trembled as she struggled to unbuckle her seatbelt, her mind racing in panic. The door was open. The plane was in danger. Why wasn't anyone doing anything? Suddenly, there was movement near the door again. The man in the dark suit had returned, standing exactly where he had been before, but this time he wasn't alone. Several people were approaching from the back of the plane, all dressed in dark clothing. They moved slowly down the aisle, and although their expressions appeared normal, their gazes were fixed on her with disturbing intensity. Daniela's heart pounded in her chest as they began moving, slowly, methodically, advancing down the aisle toward her seat. Their mouths murmured something, but it couldn't be clearly understood. Paralyzed by terror, she tried to scream, but no sound came out. She looked at the other passengers, but they remained oblivious, motionless in their seats, ignoring the threat. The figures were closer now, and Daniela could feel the cold radiating from them, seeping into her bones. Her breathing became ragged as her mind searched for an escape. She tried to press the call button for the flight attendant again, but her hand froze in midair. One of the figures was now directly in front of her. The man in the dark suit leaned down just enough for her to feel his icy breath on her skin. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, and his voice was anything but supernatural. It was cold and calculated. They were criminals. Daniela's vision blurred, her body weakened, as if the fear and uncertainty were pulling her away from the situation. She tried to move, but the group of people seemed to be preparing to take control of the plane, blocking any attempt at resistance. Daniela gasped for air, her body trembling with fear. She looked around as the passengers began to stir, unaware of what was happening. The plane seemed to be under control, but something much worse was looming. Her heart still pounded as she looked back toward the emergency exit, wondering if anyone else noticed the real danger. She knew that what lurked in the shadows of the plane hadn't left. The flight was far from over, but the real terror was just beginning. The flight to Tokyo had been calm during the first few hours. Julian gazed out the window, observing the endless darkness, with the occasional glow of moonlight illuminating the clouds below. He loved flying at night when the world beneath seemed distant and unreal, but that night something was different. There was an unsettling tension in the air which he tried to ignore, attributing it to fatigue. It had been a long day of travel, and all he wanted was to sleep through the rest of the flight. The soft hum of the plane's engines was soothing, and he closed his eyes, letting his thoughts fade away. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the back of the plane. Julian's eyes snapped open, and he straightened in his seat. The noise sounded as if something heavy had fallen, but it didn't seem to startle anyone else. The passengers around him remained asleep or absorbed in their devices. He looked around, frowning. Maybe he had imagined it. He had just settled back again when another noise, this time louder, echoed a scraping sound, like metal dragging against metal. Julian's heart began to race. He craned his neck to see the back of the plane, but the narrow aisle and dim lighting made it hard to get a clear view. Curiosity mixed with a growing sense of dread, and he unbuckled his seatbelt, deciding to investigate. As he stood up, he noticed that the flight attendants were nowhere in sight, even though they had been making rounds just minutes before. The cabin felt unusually cold, the kind of cold that seeps under your skin and makes your bones ache. Julian walked slowly toward the back, passing rows of passengers who seemed oblivious to everything. The scraping sound returned, louder now, and it was unmistakable that it was coming from the galley area in the rear. As he approached, the lights overhead flickered, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. Julian stopped just before the curtains that separated the passenger area from the galley. A strong blast of cold air hit him, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. He hesitated, but something urged him to keep going. He pulled the curtain aside. The galley was empty. There were no flight attendants, no passengers, nothing out of place, but the cold was overwhelming, almost suffocating. Julian stepped inside, his breath visible in the icy air. There was a strange smell, like something metallic and old, mixed with the faint scent of burnt plastic. His eyes scanned the area and landed on the cargo compartment door. It was slightly ajar. That was impossible. The cargo doors were supposed to stay sealed during flights. His mind raced with confusion and fear. Maybe something had malfunctioned, and that was what was causing the noises. He approached the door, drawn to it despite the fear twisting in his stomach. When he reached out to close it, something caught his attention. Movement in the darkness beyond the door. Julian froze. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but no, it was real. A human figure stood beyond the door, partially hidden by the shadows. It was tall, but its posture was unnatural. The body seemed hunched, and there was something disturbing about the way its limbs moved. too long and twisted, as if it had a deformity or had suffered some kind of accident. The figure moved slowly, almost casually, as if it had been waiting for Julian. A wave of terror washed over him, his mind screaming at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He was paralyzed, staring into the darkness as the figure drew closer slowly. Suddenly, the lights above his head flickered violently, plunging him into complete darkness. His heart pounded in his chest as the scraping sound returned, louder now, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. The air was freezing, and Julian's breathing became labored. The lights flickered back on, and the figure was gone. Julian staggered back, his body trembling. His instincts told him to run, to get away as fast as possible, but he needed to know what was happening. He reached for the cargo compartment door, his hand shaking, and opened it wider. What he saw made him freeze. Inside the cargo hold, among the luggage and boxes, he found a scene he hadn't expected. People, or at least what was left of them. They were the missing passengers. Their bodies were twisted and mutilated, scattered throughout the space with signs of torture. Julian recoiled, horrified. Everything pointed to the fact that someone on the plane, maybe more than one person, was behind it all. Julian's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. These passengers had been kidnapped, tortured, and killed, yet no one on the plane seemed to have noticed. How had it happened without him or the other passengers realizing it? Julian slammed the door shut, fear and adrenaline surging through him as he hurried back to his seat, looking for the flight attendants, but they were nowhere to be found. He felt that something far worse was happening. This plane had been hijacked, but not in the usual sense. He reached his seat, gasping for air, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He tried to call for help using his phone, but there was no signal. Panic overwhelmed him as the plane shook violently and the hum of the engines began to fail. The lights flickered again, plunging the cabin into total darkness. All that could be heard was the hum of the engines and the soft sound of breathing. But it wasn't just his breathing anymore. It was that of the attackers. He knew there was no escape. When the plane finally landed in Tokyo, the passengers began disembarking, chatting and laughing as if nothing had happened. No one noticed that Julian wasn't there. No one ever would. The midnight flight from Buenos Aires to Amsterdam was supposed to be peaceful, the kind of flight where passengers fall asleep as soon as the plane reaches cruising altitude. The cabin lights dimmed, casting a warm and sleepy glow over the rows of seats. Laura settled into her aisle seat, pulling a blanket over her lap, with her headphones playing soft music to lull her to sleep. Hours passed, and the plane flew high above the Atlantic. The constant hum of the engines was almost hypnotic. Laura quickly drifted off, sinking into the comfort of her seat. But then something changed. A sudden jolt shook the plane just enough to wake her up. Startled, she sat up, her heart racing. She looked around, expecting to see panic on the faces of the other passengers, but to her surprise, most were still asleep, unfazed. She looked out the window, but there was nothing unusual outside, just the endless darkness of the night sky. Still, the unease didn't leave her. Something was wrong. There was a feeling of heaviness in the air that tightened her chest. She took off her headphones, listening intently. The engines were still running smoothly, but there was a strange sound, a soft tapping, barely perceptible but persistent. It was rhythmic, like something metallic was tapping against the fuselage. Laura frowned and leaned into the aisle, trying to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from above. Curious and somewhat uneasy, she looked up. At first, she saw nothing. The overhead luggage compartments were securely closed, and the ceiling lights were dimmed. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, not a shadow, but a man of ordinary appearance, calmly walking down the aisle toward the back of the plane, with a suspicious air about him. Laura blinked, convinced she was imagining things. But when she looked again, the man was still there. He walked with an unnerving calmness, as if his presence wasn't meant to be noticed. Her stomach twisted with fear. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just another passenger, but as the man moved closer, something about his behavior unsettled her. It was as if he knew exactly where he was going, moving among the sleeping passengers with an odd fluidity, his gaze fixed on the back of the plane. Laura's pulse quickened. She looked around, desperate to see if anyone else had noticed. But the passengers remained asleep, their heads resting against the backs of their seats, completely oblivious to the man walking right between them. Her breathing grew shallow, her skin prickling with fear. She reached out and shook the woman sitting next to her. "Hey, wake up, do you see that man?" she whispered frantically. But the woman only stirred slightly, mumbling something incoherent before falling back into a deep sleep. The man reached the back and disappeared behind the curtains that separated the crew area. Laura felt panic rising inside her. What was happening? Desperate to get away, she fumbled with her seatbelt, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She needed to run, but there was nowhere to go. There was no place to hide on a plane flying 10,000 meters high. Suddenly, the plane shook violently, throwing trays from the seats and luggage from the overhead compartments. The lights flickered once more, and this time they went out completely. In the darkness, Laura could hear hurried footsteps. Something was happening, something that shouldn't be happening on a commercial flight. The plane trembled again, and Laura felt something brush against her arm. She jumped, terrified, and when the lights briefly came back on, she saw the man who had disappeared. He wasn't alone. 2 other men had joined him, all dressed in dark clothing and moving in a coordinated manner. They didn't look like passengers, and their movements were too precise. She knew that what she was seeing was no coincidence. Laura swallowed hard. This isn't a normal flight, she thought. This plane is in danger. She knew that something sinister was going on. The man she had seen at the start slowly approached her, his eyes locked on hers. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his tone full of menace. The crew seemed oblivious or perhaps intimidated. The plane was under their control. When the lights went out again, Laura's last thought was that this wasn't just any flight. These men were planning something much darker and more dangerous, and whatever they had in mind, no one on board would be able to escape. The turbulence was mild at first, nothing out of the ordinary for a cross-country flight. Andres had flown many times before, so he barely noticed the occasional bumps or vibrations. He was comfortably settled in his window seat, with his headphones on and his laptop open, watching a movie. The soft glow of the screen was the only light in the dark cabin, as most of the passengers had already fallen asleep. But something wasn't right. It wasn't the turbulence. There was a strange tension in the air, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. Andres paused the movie and took off his headphones. He listened carefully. The hum of the engines was steady, but there was another sound, barely audible. A faint, irregular tapping coming from the back of the plane. He leaned into the aisle, looking toward the rear. The cabin lights were dimmed for the night, and the rows of seats stretched into the darkness. The tapping came again, louder this time, followed by a soft metallic rattle. It was almost as if something was hitting the metal of the plane. Andres frowned and leaned back in his seat, feeling uneasy. He tried to shake off the fear, convincing himself it was one of those normal noises planes make. After all, planes always make strange sounds, right? Then the lights flickered, only for a second, but long enough to send a chill down his spine. The flicker was followed by a deep creak, as if the metal of the plane was under immense pressure. This was no longer turbulence. Andres looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. Some passengers shifted in their seats, but most remained fast asleep. Another flicker, this time longer. The lights went off and quickly came back on, but not before Andres saw something at the back of the plane. It wasn't a dark or ghostly figure. It was a middle-aged man walking strangely down the rear aisle. He straightened up in his seat. His rational mind tried to process what he had seen. A flight attendant? But no, the man didn't seem to be part of the crew. He walked slowly, his head tilted forward with an unsettling posture. Andres watched him disappear behind the curtain that separated the rear of the plane. Andres let out a shaky breath, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. But the air remained tense and the fear in his chest wouldn't go away. He stood up slowly, determined to investigate. He walked down the aisle toward the back of the plane, his heart racing. When he reached the galley area, the door to the cargo compartment was slightly ajar, which shouldn't be possible during a flight. At that moment, he understood that something terrible was happening. As he opened the door wider, he saw what looked like a group of people. At first, he thought they were passengers, but as he got closer, he realized the horrifying truth. They were corpses. The bodies were piled grotesquely, their limbs bent in unnatural positions. Andres's stomach churned. How had no one noticed this? His mind struggled to process the information as a terrifying thought settled in. Someone on board the plane was responsible for these deaths, and they were probably not alone. Amid his horror, Andres heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. His heart pounded as he quickly shut the cargo door, trying not to make a sound. He turned slowly and saw the same man walking toward him. Now he was accompanied by 2 more people, both with cold, calculating expressions. Panic overwhelmed him. The plane hadn't been hijacked in the conventional sense. It was part of a macabre plan involving something far worse. He knew he couldn't stay there. Without thinking, he rushed back to his seat, hoping to go unnoticed. No one else seemed aware of what was happening. When the lights flickered again, Andres looked toward the rear and saw the men approaching once more. One of them, the first man he had seen, was staring directly at him, as if he knew Andres had discovered something. There was no time to waste. Desperate, he tried to alert someone, but his phone had no signal. The plane shook violently and the overhead compartments began to open, releasing luggage that fell on the passengers. Chaos erupted in the cabin, but Andres's attention remained focused on the men moving down the aisle, getting closer to him. Just as the plane seemed to stabilize, one of the men approached Andres. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his tone full of menace. Andres knew his life was in danger. But before he could react, the man disappeared into the crowd that was starting to rise in confusion. When the plane finally landed in Amsterdam, the passengers began disembarking one by one. Andres was one of the last to leave, walking slowly down the aisle, fearing that the men were following him. As he moved away from the plane, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed something horrible, something that no one else would probably understand. He knew he would never forget what he had seen, and that those responsible were likely still lurking, hidden among the crowd, waiting for their next opportunity. The night flight from Seoul to Sao Paulo had begun without any issues. The cabin was dim, most of the passengers had settled into their seats, and the soft hum of the engines provided the perfect background for anyone looking to sleep. Helena sat by the window, staring at the night sky. There wasn't much to see, just darkness, occasionally broken by the faint glow of city lights far below or the distant twinkling of stars. Flying had always made her uneasy, but this time there was something more. An unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. The seat next to her was empty, which gave her a slight sense of relief. It was always nice to have a little more space on long flights. She pulled out a book and tried to focus on reading, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She looked around the cabin. Everyone else seemed absorbed in their own worlds, some asleep, others watching movies with their headphones on. Helena leaned back in her seat, trying to ignore the discomfort. Maybe it was just fatigue, she told herself. She closed her eyes, hoping to get some rest before landing. But then she felt it, a sudden chill on her cheek, as if someone had exhaled right next to her. She opened her eyes abruptly and looked quickly to her right. The seat was still empty, the air in the cabin still, but the cold lingered. Her heart began to race, and for some reason her instincts told her to fasten her seatbelt. She did so quickly. Though she wasn't sure why, it was just a visceral feeling that something unknown was happening. She tried to calm herself by looking out the window again, trying to distract herself. But instead of the endless darkness of the sky, what she saw froze her in place. It wasn't a supernatural figure, but a common-looking man, standing outside the plane, on the wing. With his face pressed against the window, his expression distorted into a grotesque grimace. It was impossible for anyone to be out there. Helena blinked, hoping her mind was playing tricks on her, but the man was still there. He stood, seemingly motionless, staring inside. That was terrifying. Fear washed over her as she pulled away from the window, her breath shallow, her mind trying to comprehend what she was seeing. She knew it couldn't be real. Suddenly the figure vanished, fading into the darkness. Helena gasped, her body frozen in fear. She looked around again, searching for someone else who had noticed. But everyone else seemed completely unaware of what had just happened. She was breathing quickly, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests. Just as she was about to press the button to call the flight attendant, the cabin lights flickered. For a brief moment, the cabin was plunged into darkness. It only lasted a second, but it was enough to amplify her fear. When the lights came back on, what she saw made her shudder again. The man was now inside the plane at the end of the aisle. It was the same man as before, but something about his posture and movements deeply unnerved her. He didn't seem to be alone. Helena was frozen in her seat, unable to move, as the men began to slowly walk down the aisle. None of the other passengers seemed to notice them. They were asleep, their heads resting against the windows or seatbacks, completely unaware of what was happening around them. The men moved calmly, surveying each row of passengers as if they were looking for someone specific. With each row they passed, the cabin lights flickered, and the sleeping passengers began to stir, as if they were uncomfortable but without waking up. Helena watched in horror as one of the men whispered something into a passenger's ear, and the passenger began to tremble and murmur. The lights flickered more frequently as the men got closer to Helena. They were now only a few rows away. The air around her became heavier, filled with tension. She could hear a low murmur, as if they were discussing something among themselves, planning something. Her head spun, her body trembling uncontrollably as the men approached her row. Helena tried to move, tried to unfasten her seatbelt, but her hands were frozen with fear. The man she had seen first was staring directly at her as if he knew she had been watching him from the start. His expression twisted into a smug grin, and the men's whispers grew clearer. "We know you saw us," one of them said quietly, leaning toward her. Helena felt her mind teetering on the edge of collapse. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing it would all disappear, praying that it was just a nightmare. But when she opened them again, the men were still there, standing next to her. At that moment, the plane jolted violently as it hit turbulence. The entire cabin shook, sending passengers and their belongings flying. Helena was thrown forward, but when she looked again, the men had vanished into the crowd. The plane stabilized and the lights stopped flickering. Helena was breathing heavily, her body shaking with fear and confusion. She looked around. The passengers were starting to wake up because of the turbulence, but none of them seemed to have any idea what had just happened. It was as if it had all been a bad dream, but Helena knew the truth. Those men weren't ordinary passengers, and whatever they were plotting, it wasn't over. With trembling hands, Helena pressed the button to call the flight attendant. Moments later, a flight attendant appeared, smiling kindly, as if nothing had happened. "Is everything all right, miss?" she asked, her tone polite. Helena tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Her mind was still processing what she had seen. However, as she looked more closely at the flight attendant, she noticed something that made her stop. There was an expression of indifference and coldness in her eyes, as if she were hiding something. The flight attendant continued to smile, but there was something unsettling about her behavior. "I'll bring you some water," the flight attendant said, turning to walk away. Helena couldn't shake the feeling that what she had seen and what was happening weren't coincidences. She knew those men hadn't left and that somehow the danger was still present. The plane might have landed safely, but what she had uncovered wasn't over. Not even after the flight. The flight from Buenos Aires to Cape Town was proceeding without incident. 8 hours had passed since takeoff, and most of the passengers were sound asleep, lulled by the constant hum of the engines and the dim cabin lights. Camilla, sitting by the window, had also managed to fall asleep, her head resting against the cold glass. She woke up suddenly, startled, without knowing what had pulled her from her rest. The cabin was quiet, except for a few reading lights scattered here and there. She looked around, noticing that everything seemed calm. The only sounds were the peaceful breathing of the passengers and the occasional clatter of service trays as a flight attendant walked down the aisle. Despite the apparent calm, something didn't feel right. A discomfort churned in her stomach, a deep unease that she couldn't explain. Camilla looked out the window into the total darkness surrounding the plane. The ocean stretched miles below, invisible in the night, and the stars seemed swallowed by thick clouds swirling in the distance. Trying to shake off that strange feeling, she attempted to settle back down to sleep. But then she saw something that froze her in place. It wasn't a supernatural shadow or a ghost. It was a man walking down the back aisle of the plane, a man who shouldn't have been there. He moved cautiously, trying not to be detected. Camilla noticed he was wearing a thick jacket that covered much of his face, and his hands were stuffed into his pockets. Camilla's heart began to race. She glanced at the other passengers, but they all seemed completely unaware. How could no one notice the presence of this strange man? She quickly turned her head again, and this time the man was closer. His eyes locked onto hers with a hard, calculating expression. Camilla's instincts screamed that something was very wrong. The man continued to move slowly down the aisle. As he progressed, he seemed to be carefully inspecting the pockets and belongings of the sleeping passengers. Camilla realized that he wasn't a mysterious figure from outside, but a criminal inside the plane. In her mind, fear began to blend with logic. A long overnight flight, most passengers asleep, and the crew distracted. It was the perfect setting for someone to attempt a robbery. The man momentarily disappeared toward the back of the plane, and Camilla seized the opportunity to unbuckle her seatbelt, stand up, and walk toward the front, hoping to find a flight attendant. Her heart pounded as she hurried down the aisle. She reached the rear, where a flight attendant was serving a drink to a passenger. "Excuse me," Camilla said in a low voice, trying to stay calm. "There's a man walking through the plane. I saw him checking the passengers' things. I think he's stealing." The flight attendant gave her a confused look at first, but soon her expression turned serious. "Where did you see him?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "He was back there near the galley," Camilla replied, pointing toward the back of the plane. "He was looking at the passengers' belongings." The flight attendant nodded and quickly went to notify another crew member. Camilla watched as they spoke to each other, and the tension in the air grew. While they waited, suddenly the cabin lights flickered briefly, plunging the space into momentary darkness. When the lights came back on, she saw the man again. He was standing at the end of the aisle, looking forward as if he knew he was being watched. The plane began to shake with mild turbulence, and the atmosphere in the cabin became more tense. Camilla saw some passengers start to wake up, unsettled by the movement of the plane. But what filled her with real terror was the fact that the man disappeared again, this time slipping into the rear bathroom of the plane. She knew that if no one acted quickly, that man could be planning something worse than just theft. The man emerged from the bathroom, now carrying a backpack he hadn't had before. Camilla watched him from her seat, feeling fear seize her body. The crew finally moved toward the back of the plane, trying to intercept him discreetly. However, before they could do anything, the plane hit another patch of turbulence, and amid the chaos, the man began moving faster, as if he wanted to finish what he had started. Camilla watched, paralyzed with fear, as the flight attendants tried to manage the situation quietly. The lights flickered again, and the man, taking advantage of the confusion, shoved one of the flight attendants and tried to run toward the emergency door. The crew intercepted him just in time, holding him down firmly as the passengers looked on, confused and scared by what was happening. After a brief struggle, the man was restrained. When the plane finally landed in Cape Town, he was arrested by local authorities. Camilla, still trembling from the experience, knew she would never forget that flight. The man wasn't a ghostly figure, but what he had done was just as terrifying. In a place where everyone believed they were safe, someone with dark intentions had been lurking. The flight from Monterey to Lima was unfolding like any other. Jen, who had flown many times before, didn't expect anything unusual on this journey. From her window seat near the wing, she watched as the plane ascended smoothly. With a book in her hands, she was ready to pass the time peacefully, but as the hours went by, the weather began to change. The clouds darkened, and a storm broke out on the horizon, bringing turbulence to the flight. Lightning intermittently lit up the sky, which fascinated Jen, despite the discomfort she was beginning to feel. The seatbelt sign came on, and the crew warned the passengers to remain seated. Though she wasn't afraid of storms, there was something in the atmosphere that made her nervous. The oppressive air was unusual, and the discomfort grew increasingly evident. Suddenly, something strange caught her attention as she looked out the window. A shadow moved quickly across the wing of the plane, something that made no sense. How could anything be out there at that altitude? She tried to convince herself it was an optical illusion, but when lightning lit up the sky, she saw it clearly. A human-like figure, but disproportionate, with strange, thin movements clinging to the wing. Jen's breathing became erratic as she tried to process what she was seeing. No one else seemed to notice what was happening, and her mind struggled to make sense of it. She turned her head toward the cabin, hoping someone else had seen the same thing, but the passengers continued with their activities or slept. The figure, however, disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. The turbulence intensified. The plane's shakes grew more violent, and the cabin lights began to flicker, heightening the anxiety. Suddenly, the plane made a sharp drop and some passengers screamed in fright. Jen looked around, wishing it were all just a bad dream. But things got worse. When the cabin lights came back on, the figure she had seen on the wing was now inside the plane, slowly advancing down the aisle. Its skeletal and twisted body seemed otherworldly. Jen held her breath as she watched the figure pass by the passengers, who remained oblivious to what was happening. The creature stopped, staring at a sleeping woman, and then continued moving, as if it were looking for someone else. The creature's empty gaze soon fixed on Jen. She felt a jolt of panic surge through her body, but she was frozen in her seat. The figure began to move faster, getting closer to her. The lights flickered again, and Jen, taking advantage of the brief darkness, unbuckled her seatbelt and jumped out of her seat. Adrenaline pushed her to move quickly down the aisle, bumping into other passengers, without stopping to see if the figure was following her. She reached the front of the plane in search of the flight attendants, but what she found was even more terrifying. The flight attendants were motionless, standing like statues, their bodies rigid and their faces expressionless. Jen backed away, horrified, feeling the creature was near even though she couldn't see it. Fear gripped her as she tried to think of an escape. Then the lights went out again, plunging everything into stifling darkness. She felt cold breath on the back of her neck, and before she could react, something grabbed her arm tightly, as if an invisible hand was claiming her. The night flight from New York to Paris was one Javier had taken several times before. The cabin was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the engines and the occasional cough or murmur from the passengers. Javier had just finished his in-flight meal and was reclining in his seat, ready to close his eyes and get some sleep. As he looked out the window, the night sky was completely black, with clouds swirling below, hiding the earth far beneath them. The seatbelt sign flickered on, and a crackling voice over the intercom asked the passengers to remain seated due to mild turbulence. Javier sighed and glanced around the cabin. Most people were already asleep, with their eyes closed or heads resting against the windows. A couple of flight attendants walked down the aisle, making sure everyone was securely fastened in their seats. He tried to relax and close his eyes, but a strange feeling of unease settled in his chest. He shifted in his seat, unable to shake the discomfort. There was something about the atmosphere on the flight that didn't feel right, and then he felt it, a tap on his shoulder. Javier's eyes snapped open and he turned his head to the side, expecting to see the person in the seat behind him. But there was no one. In fact, the row behind him was completely empty. He blinked, confused. Maybe it had been the turbulence, or maybe he had imagined it. He tried to settle back again, but he felt it again, this time more insistent. Cold fingers brushing the back of his neck. Javier spun around abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest, but again there was no one. The row behind him was dark and empty, with no sign of anyone nearby. He laughed nervously to himself, trying to calm down. Maybe it was just exhaustion. The plane shook lightly, a small bump of turbulence rattling the seats. Javier took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He reached for the in-flight magazine, deciding to distract himself for a moment. As he flipped through the pages, he noticed the temperature had dropped drastically, so much that he could see his own breath condensing in the air. That put him on high alert. He looked around, but the other passengers remained asleep, oblivious to the sudden cold enveloping him. His fingers began to go numb. Just as Javier was trying to process what was happening, he heard something. A low whisper. It didn't come from the passengers. No, the sound was closer. He looked around, but no one was awake. He scanned the cabin, searching for an explanation, when he saw something unsettling. At the back of the plane, a tall man in a dark jacket was standing still near the service door. Javier thought he might be a flight attendant, but there was something strange about his posture, in the way he stood so still, staring straight ahead. Javier squinted to get a better look, but suddenly the man began moving toward him, slowly, with deliberate steps. At first, Javier thought about calling for help, but then, in an instant, he remembered why he had taken this flight. He had heard rumors of organized kidnappings on night flights, of criminals using turbulence and long flights as a cover for their sinister plans. His heart raced. Something wasn't right. The man advanced, his gaze fixed on Javier. He wasn't wearing a flight attendant's uniform, nor did he show any sign of being part of the airplane crew. Javier tried to stay calm, looking for signs from the other passengers, but no one reacted. Everyone else remained asleep. Desperate, Javier pressed the button to call the flight attendant, his finger repeatedly hitting the button, but no one came. The man was getting closer, his cold, empty stare piercing through him. The plane shook slightly again from the turbulence, and as the man reached Javier's row, he made a quick motion toward his pocket. Javier panicked, jumped out of his seat, and ran toward the front of the plane. He felt trapped on a flight full of people who had no idea what was happening. He searched for a flight attendant in the service area but found no one. He knew something was very wrong. Looking back, he saw that the man was following him. His movements were fast now, no longer sluggish. The cold in the cabin intensified, and Javier ran toward the cockpit, shouting for help. Finally, a flight attendant appeared, looking at him with bewildered eyes. When he tried to explain what was happening, she nodded nervously, as if she knew more than she was letting on, and rushed to inform the captain. Javier never saw the man again for the rest of the flight, but the tension lingered in the air. What had happened wasn't an illusion, but a real threat. The overnight flight from Tokyo to Los Angeles had started without any issues. The cabin was dim and most of the passengers had already settled into their seats, with the soft hum of the engines providing the perfect backdrop for anyone looking to sleep. Eliana had set out to do the same, hoping to sleep through the entire 12-hour flight. She got comfortable in her window seat, wrapped herself in a blanket, and closed her eyes, hoping the constant sound of the plane would lull her to sleep. As the hours passed, the flight remained smooth and the cabin stayed nearly dark. However, something kept Eliana from sleeping deeply. A feeling of unease settled in her chest, interrupting her rest. At first she thought it was due to fatigue or jet lag, but the discomfort persisted, as if her body were warning her about something. She opened her eyes slowly and noticed something strange. The seat beside her, which had been empty when she boarded, was now occupied. She didn't recall seeing anyone sit there after takeoff. The figure, wrapped in a dark hooded jacket, appeared to be asleep, with their face tilted to the side. Eliana looked again, confused. She was certain no one had been in that seat before. A chill ran down her spine, but she tried to convince herself that it was just a passenger who had switched seats. She looked out the window, focusing on the vast darkness surrounding the plane, but that feeling of danger wouldn't go away. Her breathing quickened, and when she turned her head once more, the seat was empty again. Fear began to take hold of her. She knew she hadn't imagined it. She gripped the armrests tightly and nervously glanced around, but all the other passengers were still in their own worlds, absorbed in their devices or sleeping peacefully. There was no sign that anyone had been sitting next to her. Then in the aisle, 2 rows ahead, a man was staring at her. His expression wasn't normal. His eyes were wide open and filled with terror. It wasn't just fear that she saw on his face, but something darker, something indescribable. The man seemed petrified, as if he had seen something unimaginable. Eliana tried to look away, but she couldn't. Her heart pounded and her hands were sweaty. Suddenly, the cabin lights flickered, and for a moment everything was plunged into darkness. When the lights returned, the man had disappeared. She stood up immediately, sensing that something terribly wrong was happening. She went to press the call button for a flight attendant, but no one responded. The air around her felt stifling, and the shadows seemed to stretch with every step she took. She walked toward the back of the plane, searching for a flight attendant or any sign of life. When she arrived, the service stations were empty and the lights were barely flickering, casting uneven shadows throughout the plane. "Is anyone here?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. But there was no response. Suddenly, at the far end of the aisle, past the bathrooms, she saw a tall, thin figure. It seemed motionless, but the way its body leaned forward was unnatural. Eliana felt a knot in her stomach, and every fiber of her being told her to run, but she couldn't move. The figure began to slowly advance toward her, its movements strange and erratic. The lights flickered again, and this time the darkness lasted longer. The sound of footsteps echoed in the cabin, getting closer and closer. But when the lights returned, the figure had disappeared. She returned to her seat, her mind in chaos. When she arrived, she looked out the window again, expecting to see only the endless ocean in the night's darkness. However, what she saw froze her completely. All the passengers were sitting, completely upright in their seats, with their eyes wide open as if frozen in time. Their gazes, empty and filled with fear, were fixed on her. Feeling her body freeze with terror, she took a few steps back, bumping into something solid. As she slowly turned around, she saw it. A tall, dark figure standing right behind her, with hollow eyes staring at her from deep within the shadows. She couldn't scream. The figure leaned toward her and the darkness engulfed her completely. Hours later, when the flight landed in Los Angeles, the passengers began to disembark one by one. However, when they reached Eliana's row, her seat was empty. Her luggage was still in the overhead compartment, and her phone and laptop remained in the seatback pocket. But there was no trace of her. She had simply vanished into the night, leaving behind only the cold that lingered long after the plane had landed.